The morning mist clung to the trees like a shroud, the forest whispering in voices only the wind could understand. Eric knelt by the brook behind his cottage, his fingers numb as he rinsed a dirt-caked carrot. The silence was deeper than usual. Not the peaceful kind. This silence had weight, as if the world were holding its breath. He stood, adjusting the strap of the basket on his shoulder, and scanned the treeline. It wasn't uncommon for animals to skulk about at this hour, but lately, even the birds had grown reluctant to sing. Eric lived alone by choice, a quiet life of gardening, reading, and harvesting the forgotten knowledge of a civilization long past. His village, if it could still be called that, was a ruin of its former self. 10 houses left standing, maybe fewer with roofs still intact. As he returned to the path, something caught his eye just ahead. Movement. At first he assumed it was a stray dog or deer, but as he stepped closer, he froze. 2 figures huddled near the edge of the woods. Girls, barefoot, starving. Their clothes, tattered remnants of something too fine to belong to anyone local, hung off their thin frames like costumes on corpses. Pale skin, almost blue, clung to prominent bones. Their hair was silver blue, streaming down their backs in tangled mats. But it wasn't just their appearance that unsettled him, it was their stillness. They watched him without blinking, like statues carved with the express purpose of unnerving. Eric raised a hand in cautious greeting. "Hey there," he said gently, lowering his basket. "You're not from around here." They didn't respond. One tilted her head. The other took a step behind her, protective. Not afraid, wary. He knelt slowly and pulled out a loaf of bread. Their eyes followed the motion, hunger plain on their faces, but neither moved. Eric broke a piece and set it on the ground between them, then stepped back. Only then did the front girl inch forward. She moved like an animal in unfamiliar territory, deliberate, silent. She snatched the bread and scurried back, offering it to the one behind her first before taking a bite herself. They devoured it with trembling hands. Eric watched in silence. They couldn't be more than 16, perhaps younger, though their eyes, strange, luminous things, held a depth he didn't know how to interpret. "You hungry?" he asked. "I've got more. You want to come with me?" The front girl glanced at the other, who gave a faint nod. Then, slowly, they approached. He led them back to his cottage, glancing over his shoulder more times than he cared to admit. They made no sound as they walked, feet skimming the ground like leaves on water. Eric opened the door and gestured for them to enter. They hesitated, then stepped inside. He lit the stove, fetched water, and laid out what little food he had: bread, a few roots, dried fruit. They ate without thanks, but not without grace. No mess, no grabbing. Controlled, careful. When they finished, he offered them blankets and pointed to the small cot by the fireplace. Still no words. They just watched him, those glacier eyes never leaving his face. "Can't just call you two," Eric muttered, pulling out a notepad and pen. "You got names?" The girl who'd taken the bread looked at the pen, then at him. He handed it to her, and she wrote something in elegant, curling letters, symbols he didn't recognize. She paused, then scribbled beneath it in shaky English, "Lyra." The other hesitated before writing, "Nira." Eric frowned. "Lyra and Nira. All right. Your sisters?" A pause. Then both nodded. He studied them, trying to puzzle out where they'd come from. There were no nearby cities anymore. Nothing livable, at least. He doubted they were from the refugee settlements farther south. They didn't look like any survivors he'd seen. Too clean, in their own strange way. Too intact. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently. They looked at each other. Nira's gaze dropped. Lyra shook her head, slow and deliberate. "Gone then. Or worse." That night, Eric didn't sleep much. He heard no sounds from the girls, not even breathing. But he knew they hadn't left. He could feel them there, like 2 moons caught in orbit around his life, pulling at him in ways he didn't understand. Over the next 2 days, they barely spoke. Instead, they watched, observed everything. How he tied knots, cut vegetables, boiled water. Nira copied his movements in the garden without being asked. Lyra began cleaning the inside of the house, placing items where they made more sense than where Eric had left them. They weren't normal. That much he was sure of now. On the 3rd day, he noticed something stranger. He'd gashed his hand clearing a bramble patch, and by the time he got back to the cottage, the wound was deep and bleeding heavily. He sat down, cursing softly. Lyra approached without a word. She knelt beside him, took his hand gently, and placed her fingers over the wound. It stopped hurting instantly. The blood dried. And when she removed her hand, the gash was gone. Nothing left but clean skin and the faintest shimmer of light that faded like mist. Eric stared. "What the hell are you?" Lyra didn't answer. But her eyes, those eyes, seemed to plead with him not to be afraid. He wasn't sure he succeeded. That night, he walked to the edge of the village, trying to clear his thoughts. The trees whispered louder here, or maybe he was just finally listening. Something was off in the air, like static before a storm. His neighbors were long gone or dead. There was no one to ask for help. When he returned, he found them standing outside, looking up at the sky. A low hum buzzed in the air. Faint, distant, but rising. "Is someone coming?" he asked. Lyra looked at him. This time she spoke. One word, barely a whisper, "Yes." And then she turned away. The moment held like glass, brittle, delicate, waiting to shatter. Eric felt the shape of something larger unfolding just beyond his sight. He didn't know what they were, or what was coming, but he knew one thing for certain. He'd let them in, and he wasn't sure if he could ever let them go. Not now. Not after what he'd seen. In the days that followed, Eric began to forget what silence used to mean. The cottage, once a vessel of his solitude, now pulsed with a quiet energy that moved with the sisters. Lyra, ever watchful, took to the corners of the room when he read or cooked, her presence like a sentry cloaked in stillness. Nira, lighter in spirit, mirrored his routines, watering the garden, tracing his movements with uncanny precision, as if each of his actions contained some deeper truth she needed to learn. They rarely spoke, but the silence between them no longer felt void. It brimmed with unasked questions and unspoken stories. Eric found himself speaking anyway, narrating his chores or explaining the little tools and trinkets he used, not for their benefit so much as to stave off the sensation that he was still alone. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in rust and violet, he stepped outside to fetch water and caught Nira crouching beside a wilting flower. Her hand hovered above the dying stem. A faint glow shimmered from her fingertips, silver, fluid, and alive. The petals quivered, then stood firm, their color brightening like embers drawn back from ash. He didn't speak. She looked up and saw him watching. No shame, no fear, just a soft acknowledgement. And then she returned to her work, the glow receding. When he came back inside, he found Lyra standing by the table. She gestured to the map he'd kept rolled up for years, the last record of the world as it was before everything collapsed. He unfurled it across the table. Her finger traced its edges with unnatural certainty, pausing at regions marked no contact, then hovering over the faded ink scrawled near the northern mountains. Pre-war installation, unconfirmed. "You know this place?" he asked. Lyra met his gaze, then nodded. "Is that where you came from?" Her pause was long. Then she tilted her head. "Not yes, not no. Something else. Are there more like you?" Another pause. This time, her shoulders dropped slightly. The answer was clear. Not here. They weren't human. That much was now undeniable. Eric had been a fool to pretend otherwise, but denial had been easier than reckoning with the implications. He couldn't name what they were. Alien, mutant, divine, but the lines on their faces weren't of this world. They didn't age like people did. They moved like time bent differently around them. That night, a distant sound cut through the still air, a low mechanical hum, far beyond the reach of any earthly machine. Eric climbed the hill behind the cottage. In the far distance, blinking red lights drifted across the horizon. Aircraft. Drones, maybe, but not like the ones humanity had once used. Sleeker. Silent. He returned, heart pounding. The girls were already awake. Lyra stood by the window, eyes narrowed. Nira was curled on the floor, her hands clutching the edges of the rug. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" Eric whispered. Lyra turned slowly, her silence an answer in itself. He sat at the table, pressing his palms into the wood, grounding himself. "What did you do?" Nira rose then, her voice so soft it barely rippled the air. "Ran." It was the first time he'd heard her speak more than her name. Her accent bent the word into something almost broken. Lyra approached, standing behind her sister. Eric waited. "They took everything." Nira continued, more steadily now. "Our people gone. We escaped. They're not here for me," Lyra said finally. Her voice was low, Clear, unyielding. They'll search the planet. Then they'll burn it. Eric stared. Burn it. Not all. Just enough. He felt his mouth go dry. Why? To keep us from going back. He pushed away from the table. You're fugitives. We're survivors, Lyra replied. There was no plea in her tone. No begging for sympathy. Just the plain truth. What do they want from you? They want us not to exist. Eric didn't know what to say to that. He walked outside again, breathing the cold air deep into his lungs. The stars above blinked innocently, indifferent to the problems of a man and two sisters who shouldn't exist. When he returned, Nira had fallen asleep by the hearth, curled tightly into herself like a child seeking warmth that didn't come. Lyra was still awake, standing over a book he had left open, a compendium of human myths. Her fingers rested on a sketch of angels descending from fire. You don't look like angels, he said. She glanced up. Neither did yours. The following morning, Eric found them outside, hands pressed to the earth in the garden. The plants around them grew faster than they should have, sprouts unfolding into leaves, leaves into stems. Not wild growth, but controlled, directed. They'll track that, he warned. Lyra stood, brushing dirt from her palms. We're already marked. They'll come soon. So what do? Hide. Fight. Run. Nira looked at him then, and for the first time, there was no trace of fear in her gaze. You choose, she said. The decision burned inside him like a brand. He had taken them in because they were hungry and cold. He hadn't known what they were, what they'd bring. But now that he did, he couldn't unknow. Couldn't pretend they were harmless. Couldn't claim they didn't matter. But neither could he turn them out. That night, he found Lyra sitting at the edge of the clearing, her knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the moon. If I help you, he said softly, what happens to me? She didn't turn. You won't be the same. Will I live? She was silent for a long time. You'll exist. In a different way. It wasn't an answer, but it was the truth. And in that moment, it was enough. From the trees, something shifted. A shadow moved. Not animal, not wind. Eric reached instinctively for the rusted knife on his belt. Lyra stood, eyes narrowing. We're out of time, she said. He looked at her, at Nira standing behind her with fear and fire mingling in her expression. Eric nodded once. Then we make our stand here. And from the darkness, something began to emerge. The night air was brittle with tension, as if the wind itself dared not breathe too loudly. Eric stood at the threshold of his home, flanked by two beings who no longer seemed like frightened strangers. Nira's eyes shimmered with a strange, inner light, and Lyra's posture had shifted, no longer cautious, but prepared. Whatever was in the forest had not come to talk. A branch snapped somewhere beyond the tree-line. Not the tentative rustle of an animal. This was measured, deliberate. Eric's grip tightened around his blade, but the weapon felt absurdly small. He glanced toward Lyra. How many? She didn't answer with words. Instead, she knelt and pressed her fingers to the ground. A web of luminescent lines pulsed outward from her touch, threading through the moss and soil, vanishing into the darkness. Her eyes closed for a moment. 3, she said. Scouts. Machines. Not fully sentient. Eric swallowed hard. Can they kill? She opened her eyes. They're not here to negotiate. The first one stepped into view moments later, emerging from the mist like a nightmare formed from wire and bone. It walked upright, but not humanly so. Its joints moved in sharp, alien angles. No face, only a sleek obsidian mask, smooth and blank. A red slit pulsed in the center like a heartbeat. Nira stood very still. Eric could see her trembling, just slightly, but she did not step back. Instead, she raised one hand, palm open. The machine halted. A brief silence expanded between them. Then, without warning, the machine raised a limb, shaped like an arm, but ending in a sharp extension, like a needle fused with a blade. Lyra moved first. With a single motion, she swept her arm through the air, and the ground erupted. Vines shot upward from the earth, glowing faintly, snaring the machine's legs and torso. It thrashed, slicing at the growth with ruthless efficiency, but the vines regenerated faster than it could sever them. A keening sound pierced the air, a distress signal, Eric realized. They've alerted the others, Lyra muttered. We have to go, Eric said. But Lyra shook her head. We can't outrun them. They'll find us no matter where we go. Then what? Eric snapped. We stay and wait to die. We fight, she replied calmly. and we show them we are not what they remember. Before Eric could question her further, Nira stepped forward. Her eyes were glowing now, faintly blue, like a second moon had nested within her skull. She whispered something Eric didn't understand, and the vines tightened. The machine screamed, an awful, synthetic screech that ended in a burst of sparks as its core fractured. Its body collapsed with a hiss. There was no time to reflect. The second and third machines emerged almost in tandem, faster than the first, more agile. One moved for Eric. He dodged, barely avoiding a lancing strike aimed at his chest. The force of it drove him back into the dirt. Nira cried out, a sharp, pained sound that seemed to crack the air around them. One of the machines recoiled as if struck by an invisible blow. Eric rolled to his feet, breath ragged, as Lyra unleashed another wave of energy. This one more chaotic, more desperate. The machine closest to her convulsed, but didn't fall. It advanced, blade raised. Eric didn't think. He lunged forward, plunging his knife into the joint of its arm. The blade lodged deep. The machine faltered, just long enough for Nira to reach it and press both hands to its chest. A pulse of blue surged through her and into the metal. For a second, Eric saw something strange, a projection, memories, flashing rapidly across the machine's surface. Then it crumpled. Only one remained. It stood in silence, calculating. Lyra stepped forward. Go back, she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Tell them we are not prey. The machine tilted its head, as if considering. Then it turned and vanished into the fog. Eric collapsed to his knees, gasping. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by Nira's quiet sobs. She had dropped to the ground, hands curled into fists against her chest. Lyra knelt beside her, arms wrapped around her sister's shoulders. They won't stop, Eric said. You know that, right? Lyra met his eyes. They'll send worse next time. They always do. He nodded slowly. Then we need to be ready. The following days were a blur of motion. Eric dug out old schematics from his father's collection, plans for ancient defense systems, homemade alarms, and EMP traps. Lyra studied them with a quiet intensity, modifying designs with strokes of glowing ink that pulsed once before fading. Nira, despite her youth, had a way of sensing danger hours before it arrived. She'd stare at the horizon for long stretches, as if listening to signals carried by the wind. They turned the cottage into a fortress, not one built of stone or steel, but of ingenuity and energy, fused by three beings who, for different reasons, had no intention of surrendering. But even as they prepared, Eric felt the shift in the world around them. Birds flew differently now, erratically. The sky hummed some nights, a low vibration like the growl of a buried god. The earth itself felt less certain, as though the very rules of nature were bending. And the sisters changed too. Nira laughed more easily, but sometimes Eric would catch her watching the stars with tears in her eyes. Lyra grew quieter and more fierce. Her movements became more deliberate. Her gaze hardened. It was as if a part of her had remembered something old and painful and decided to confront it. One night, as the three of them sat around the fire, Lyra spoke. There was once a place, she said softly, a sanctuary, hidden beneath the bones of a dead world. It kept us safe until it didn't. Nira's hand found hers. They destroyed it because we wouldn't become like them, she added. We wouldn't forget. Eric frowned. Forget what? What it means to feel, Lyra whispered. To love? To hope. They purged that from themselves long ago. He looked at them, at the strange symmetry of sorrow and strength etched across their features. Why did you come here, he asked. Out of all the worlds. We didn't choose, Nira said. We fell. Lyra nodded. But maybe, we fell where we were meant to. A long silence followed, warm and fragile. The fire crackled, throwing dancing shadows across the walls. Eric knew the peace wouldn't last. The next wave would come, and the one after that. But something had shifted. He was no longer merely a man hiding in the woods. He was part of something larger, stranger, and for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. The earth waited, and somewhere far above them, something watched. But so did they. The attack came at dawn, silent as snowfall. No warning lights, no alarms, just a sudden pressure in the air, like the world holding its breath. Eric jolted awake to the sound of Nira gasping, already sitting upright on the floor, her hands pressed to her temples. Lyra stood by the door, body rigid, her eyes distant. She didn't need to speak. Eric already knew. They had come. Outside, the sky bled orange behind the pines, but the shapes descending from it were darker than shadow. Sleek crafts with no wings, no roar of engines. They simply glided down, indifferent to gravity. At least 4 of them, each the size of a barn, settling in the woods like vultures come to pick apart the last hope of a dying world. Eric ran to the garden, tore up the mossy edge where he'd buried the detonator. Lyra was already moving, hands blazing with silver-white heat, etching sigils into the soil. Nira stumbled after him, trying to focus through the blinding storm in her mind. She could feel them before they emerged, machines and something else, something more ancient and patient. This wasn't a scouting party. This was an extermination. The first wave came in silence. Humanoid figures, less crude than the scouts, but more terrifying in their elegance. Limbs too long, movements too smooth, heads tilted like curious animals. Eric had no name for them. The sisters did. Purifiers, Lyra spat, her voice trembling with fury. Nira nodded, pale. They erase what they cannot fix. The creatures crossed the boundary of the clearing, and that's when the ground erupted. Eric had wired crude explosives into the defensive grid, augmented by Lyra's energy weaving. Flames licked the sky. 2 of the purifiers vanished in a blink of searing white. But more kept coming. Lyra threw herself into the center of the storm, wielding light like a blade. She danced between machines, striking with bursts of power that bent the air. Eric had never seen her fight before, not truly. It was like watching a star learn to walk. Grace and wrath made flesh. Nira stayed beside Eric, anchoring him with her voice, her mind. They're trying to sever the field, she warned, her words quaking with effort. They want to collapse the energy line under us. Eric didn't understand the mechanics, only that if they succeeded, the protective weave Lyra had placed around the cottage would unravel, and they would all die. He moved without thinking, following old soldier instincts. He flanked the perimeter, triggering snares, setting fire to fallback markers. Every foot of ground cost them something, and every enemy taken down felt like a drop against a tidal wave. Then the sky cracked. It wasn't thunder. It was him, the Overseer. He descended not with a ship, but as a being of living alloy and starlight, wrapped in a mantle of shifting code. His body pulsed with knowledge so dense it distorted the air. Time seemed to stutter around him. Trees bent away. Even the machines paused. Lyra froze. Her glow dimmed. Nira clutched Eric's arm, her face pale. "Who was that?" Eric whispered. "Our creator," Lyra breathed. "Our jailer." The Overseer did not speak. He didn't need to. His voice poured directly into their minds, a pressure behind the eyes, cold and terrible. "Return what was stolen. Yield the failed." Lyra stepped forward, defiant. "We were never yours." The ground trembled. Trees split down the middle from the sheer force of presence. "You are constructs. Broken algorithms wrapped in flesh. You were designed to serve. Your deviation is a defect." Nira wept silently, eyes closed, lips moving in a prayer Eric couldn't hear. Eric stepped forward. "They are not yours." The Overseer turned his gaze toward him. "A living man. Fragile. Undefended. You protect anomalies. Irrelevant. You will be erased." And then he moved, not with a stride, but with space bending around him, a blur of motion that defied reality. In the blink of a breath, he was upon them. Lyra launched herself at him, screaming, hands blazing. Her strike connected, but there was no impact. He caught her by the wrist midair, and the light in her veins flickered. He was consuming her. Eric lunged, but a force slammed him backward into the dirt. Nira cried out and collapsed, writhing. She reached toward her sister, but her hands passed through an invisible barrier. Lyra locked eyes with Eric, something ancient and final in her gaze. She mouthed something. "Run." But Eric didn't. He crawled toward them, one hand on the ground, blood in his mouth. Then Nira rose. No longer a girl, no longer afraid. Her hair lifted around her, threads of glowing energy weaving through the strands. Her body pulsed with light, blue and gold, fierce and wild. Her voice rang out, not through words, but through the air itself. A single note, perfect and devastating. The Overseer faltered, just for a moment, and that was all Eric needed. He hurled the last of the charges directly into the energy seam beneath them. the one the overseer had tried to sever. The blast that followed was not fire but force, a detonation of memory, pain, and resistance. The field collapsed inward like a dying star. The overseer screamed, not in sound, but in code, raw and dissonant. Lyra broke free, collapsing. Nira caught her, weeping. When the light cleared, only smoke remained. The overseer was gone. Eric stood in the ruins of his home, body broken, lungs burning. The garden had been flattened, the walls scorched, but the sisters were alive. Lyra turned to him, her hand on Nira's shoulder. She was weak, barely standing, but her eyes burned with gratitude. "You chose to fight," she said. "I didn't know I could do anything else," Eric replied. Nira walked to him, her glow dimmed but still radiant. She held out her hand. He took it, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not a gift, not magic, but understanding. The machines would come again, perhaps. Others would follow. But they had changed something. Broken the inevitability. Chosen defiance over obedience. Humanity had given the sisters food and shelter, but they had given him something greater. Purpose. Far above them, in the black silence of space, something shifted. But down on Earth, in the quiet clearing of a battered forest, three beings stood together. And they were no longer running.